The ones that make you like trip and die.
Yes.
Straight away.
All right, so it's time to go ahead and get started today. Okay, so the lecture is going to be long today. My earlier section was like 2 hours. We did take about a 5 or 10 minute break, but it's still it was quite lengthy. So we have the lecture, and then there is an activity. The activity is a little long too. So I don't know if you'll have much time for the lab today, but remember, lab 4, it's not due until after the midterm. Remember, the midterm's Thursday, and lab 4 is due Friday of this week. And after the midterm, there's a lecture, but that lecture should be fairly short. Is there anyone that's done with lab 4? Did anyone finish? Okay, not bad. About the same number as mine, 8 to 11. So yeah, if you're done with lab 4, after lecture today, there's a little bit of lab 5 that you could do, but lab 5 is not going to be due till the end of next week, like a week from this Friday. So you have plenty of time to do 5. But I mean, if you were done with the activity and you wanted to start on lab 5, provided you're done with lab 4, you could. Okay, it's a little bit easy. All right, but here's today's agenda. So today we're going to talk about sequential circuits. Up until this point, we've only talked about combinational type circuitry. Who can tell me the 2 things you don't have with a combination or combinatorial? Combinatorial and combinational means the same thing.
You don't have any clock cycles or memory.
Yeah, exactly. There's no memory with the combinatorial type circuit. And also you don't have what we call a clock, which is a type of square wave signal that we'll talk more about later. Now, combinatorial or combinational, again, do the same thing. The circuits haven't been doing up to this point. They have another main feature that I haven't mentioned, and that's a combinatorial combinational logic circuit. The output only depends, so solely depends on input. So, all the circuitry, we've been looking at thus far this quarter, they would have a number of inputs and either a single output or, multiple outputs, but the output or outputs would only depend on what our inputs were. Now, another thing from a previous discussion that's going to be important for this class is the truth table of a NAND gate. So who can tell me what the truth table of a NAND gate is? When do we get an output of a 0 with a NAND gate?
1, 1.
Yeah, when the inputs are all 1, right? So here, when both inputs are 1, we get a 0 out. And in all other cases, the output of the NAND gate is going to be a 1, correct? So 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. Okay, the way I remember, so I always remember, well, an AND gate, you only get a 1 out when all the inputs are 1. And since a NAND is equal to an AND with an inverted output, well, with an AND, you only get a 0 out when all inputs are. Okay, well, sequential circuits do have memory. And they do require a clock signal. And also, and this is a key difference between the sequential and the combinational, is that the output of a sequential circuit depends on inputs and outputs. That's the big difference, right? Combinational, the output only depends on inputs. A sequential circuit, the output not only depends on the inputs, but also on output. So you see here, there's a connection between the output and an input. And when you have this type of connection between an output and an input, it's called feedback. Okay, so sequential circuits have feedback where combinational circuits do not. Now, the reason why memory is important now, I would think even before coming to classes, you would think, oh, well, memory is important because that's how you can store information, right? Retain information from a previous time. But also, the reason why memory is important is because if you have a sequence of events, the cube, it's supposed to be a cube. If you have a sequence of events, you know, like say, and I'm being very general here, but you know, say you have event A, right? And from A, you can go to event B. And then from event B, you can go to event C. And then from C to D, and so on, right? You have some sequence of events. Well, doing a sequence of events is only possible if you have memory, because to know where to go next, you have to know where you are currently, right? You have to have some memory of where you are to know where you're going to go. This directly ties into what we're going to talk about next week. Next week, we're going to talk about circuitry called a finite state machine, okay, or FSM. That's the acronym for finite state machine. And you'll see that when you design one of these finite state machines that do sequence of events, you make a diagram. It's called a state diagram, which you could also call an event diagram if you wanted to. But you start with a diagram, and then from that diagram, you do your design. And FSMs, because they do sequences, they contain memory. You'll see it's circuitry that has both memory and combinational circuitry. That's where we're kind of headed next week.
If you have like an internal logic, would that still be considered feedback, or does it have to be like the output of a module?
Yeah, feedback is specifically a connection between an output and input. And it not only applies to logic circuitry, it applies to other circuitry, you know, like analog, like you see in circuit classes. In fact, are you CPE or E?
CPE. But probably gonna sound like op amps or something like that, where you have like
Right, an op amp is an example. That's an analog example of feedback. The reason I asked your major was because I know the EEs take the control class in their junior year. I'm not sure when the CPEs take it or whether it's an elective, but anyway, if you ever take a controls class, that's like day one of a controls class. If you talk about feedback, and there's a whole theory behind it. I mean, it's like in that class, you start talking about the first day, but like the whole course is about feedback, basically. You know, there's different types of feedback and, you know, different purposes and things like that. But anyway, here, the feedback is needed to have a sequential circuit, and that's what gives us memory. Okay, so far, you know, this has been sort of just general information, you know, kind of contrasting sequential to combinational type circuitry. But now we're going to get more specific, okay? More specific with sequential circuitry. And we're going to start here. See, this logic circuit of 2 NAND gates, this is called a latch. And just like 2's complement has 2 meanings depending on whether it's a noun or a verb, right? Remember we talked about like 2's complement, the noun is that list of numbers I gave you, you know, in that handout. And then the verb 2's complement, when you take the 2's complement, you're negating a binary number, right? Well, sort of the same thing with latch. Latch, the noun, is this type of circuit. Okay, now it's not always made out of NAND gates, okay, but it has the same sort of features we're going to talk about in a second. But the noun latch means a logic circuit like this one that can store a bit, you know, can store either a 0 or a 1. Latch, the verb, means to store data. I can say, you know, like this 1 is being stored, or this 0, or this bit is being stored, or I can just say, well, that bit's being latched. Okay, and latch has the same meaning as store when it's used as a verb. Okay, but as a noun, it's talking specifically about a logic circuit that can store a bit. Now, notice, well, next thing is S and R in this diagram. These are inputs. Okay, so S and R are inputs. Q and not Q, these are outputs. But notice, and this is a key feature of a latch. Notice that the output of this NAND gate goes to one of the inputs of this other NAND gate. And then the output of this NAND gate goes to one of the inputs of this other NAND. See, this type of connection is called cross-coupled. Okay, a latch always has cross-coupled gates. See, this is a cross-coupled NAND latch. It's made out of NAND gates, but you can also make a latch out of cross-coupled NORs. In fact, that's one of the activities today, is that we're going to go through this NAND latch here in class, and then as an activity, I'm going to have you show the same process that I'm going to go through here at the board for a NOR latch. Okay, which is the same circuit, just made of NOR gates instead of NAND. Okay. All right, so this is the actual circuit that you would hook up on a breadboard. This is the actual circuit that you would model, like in System Verilog. But then we have this other circuit that we call an analysis circuit. And this analysis circuit isn't what we would actually hook up, but it's just serves the purpose of making the analysis of this actual circuit that you would hook up easier. And you see what's in this analysis circuit that makes it an analysis circuit is you see this block here, TD. TD stands for time delay. It's not like you can hook up a time delay on a breadboard, okay? But in our analysis circuit, we're representing a time delay with this box here. Okay, so we have our two NAND gates. You know, here's the R input, here's the S input. And then on this side of this time delay, the Q plus stands for next state of output Q. And then just Q, okay, which is on the other side of this time delay box. This is representing the present state of output Q. Okay, so Q is what the Q output is now. Q plus is what the Q output is going to be. Okay. All right, so now we're going to make a truth table. And in this truth table, we're treating S and R as inputs, and we're also treating the present state of Q as an input. And then the only output we have is the next state of Q. And we're doing this because it's going to lead us to a slightly more compact truth table for this NAND latch that will help explain how it functions. Okay. All right, but getting back here to this truth table. Since I have three inputs in this truth table, right, where each input's a bit, it's going to be a 0, 1. How many unique combinations of zeros and ones can I have? How many rows in this truth table since there's three inputs? 2. Right, again, 2 to the 3. Right, if you want to know how many unique combinations of zeros and ones you can have from a certain number of bits, it's always 2 to the number of bits, right, equals the number of values. So we've done this a number of times, right, where we put these bits in binary order. So all zeros, then 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, and then all of them. Okay, so just make sure I didn't make a mistake. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 8, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Again, keep an eye on what I'm doing. If I make a mistake, please correct me. All right, so now we're going to come up with the output here, next state of Q. And we're just going to go row by row. So first row, S is 0, R is 0, present state of Q. Now, this is where getting some insight into a truth table can help us. Okay, remember we did this once before where we took a truth table and we divided it in half. In fact, we did the NAND gate like this back when we were talking about universal gates and how you can use a NAND gate as an inverter. And remember we said, well, if you just look at the bottom 2 rows, if one input to a NAND gate is a 1, well, the output is equal to the inverse of the other input, right? Remember that? Also, we talked about how if you connect the inputs of any gate together, or any gate for that matter, it's gonna make the inputs the same value. Right, so if we connect these NAND gate inputs together, we're either in the top row where we have zeros going in and a one coming out, or we're in the bottom row where ones are going in and the zeros coming out, right? So again, the NAND gate can act like an inverter if you connect the inputs together. Well, for what we're about to analyze over in that latch circuit, what's helpful is looking at the top two rows, right? Because you see what the top two rows tell us? If one input to a NAND gate is a 0, I'm going to get a 1 out regardless what the other input is, right? Because if the other input's a 0, I get a 1 out. If the other input's a 1, I get a 1 out, right? So if one input to a NAND gate is a 0, I don't have to know what the other input is. The output's going to be a 1. Okay? And you see, that can help us. Because now when I look at this circuit for this top row where all these, the R, the S, and the Q are all equal to 0. Well, I'm trying to get this output, right? And this output is the output of this NAND gate. And if S is 0, this has to be a 1. I don't even have to bother analyzing anything else. If this is a 0, no matter what this input is, I'm going to get a 1 out. Okay, so Q plus would just be a 1 here. Okay. The next row, the only thing that changes is Q becomes 1, but I still have the same situation where this input's a 0, so I'm going to get a 1 out. Again, I don't have to know what this other input is. Okay, so you see, this would be 1. I'm going to line this up here. Okay, the next row, let's see, the next row, Q is 0. And S is, or no, S is 0. Yeah, S is 0. S is still 0. R changes. R becomes a 1. Okay, but we still have this input equal to 0, so this output's still going to be 1, just like it was the previous 2 times. Okay, and then the next row, well, this becomes a 1. R is still a 1, but again, S is still a 0, so as long as that's a 0, next state of Q, Q plus is going to be a 1. So this will also be a 1. Okay, the next row. See, the next row, S is 1, R is 0, and Q is 0. Okay, so here, because this S input's a 1, well, this input does matter, right? Because again, it's only when we have one input equal to a 0 to an NAND gate, I don't have to know what the other input is. If I have an input equal to a 1 to a NAND gate, now I got to know what this other input is to get what the output is. Okay, well, this input's connected to the output of this NAND, and this NAND has a 0 as one of its inputs, so this output would be a 1. Okay, which is going to make this input a 1 along with the other input being a 1, and that will make Q plus a 0. Okay, so is this all making sense so far? Because if this is all making sense, I mean, the rest of it's just more of the same, right? Just different inputs here. So, okay, let's do the next row. The next row, we got S is a 1. S is a 1, R is a 0. Oh, the only thing that changed from this row to this row is Q change value, but it's going to be the same thing, right? Because a 0 here means this output's a 1. So now, again, you got 2 1s at the input of this NAND gate, which is going to make Q plus a 0. All right, so let's see. This row, Q is 0. R and S are both 1. Okay, so this row here, we got Q equal to 0. R and S are both 1. So again, since this is a 1, I have to know what this input is, which is the same as this output. And because this is a 1, to know this output, I have to know this input here. And you see, this input is connected directly to Q. So whatever Q is, that's also what's at this input. Okay, so a 1 and a 0 here is going to give us a 1, right? And then 2 1s into this NAND gate is going to give us the 0s. Okay, and then the last row we have all 1s, right? R is a 1, S is a 1. Q is a 1. So again, Q is directly connected to this input. So whatever Q is also what this input is. So 2 1s at the input of the main gate gives me a 0. And then a 0 and a 1 will give me a 1, right? Okay, so any questions on that table? Do you have a question?
Oh.
Are you good? Okay. So everybody's good. Everybody see how I went through and got Q plus here, right? We're just using our knowledge of a NAND drill. Okay. Okay, so the next thing is we're going to take this table and put it into a slightly more compact form. Okay, we're only showing S and R and Q plus, the next state of Q. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to partition this truth table every 2 rows. So I'm going to take these top 2 rows and these next 2 rows. And then these next 2 rows. And the last 2 rows. Okay, so we're partitioning this into 4. Okay. All right, now I'm going to start with these 2 rows. Okay, for no particular reason other than I want to save these top 2 rows for last because there's something special about those top 2 rows. But here in these 2 rows, look, S is 0 for both and R is 1 for both. So I'm going to put that over here in this truth table. And for both of these rows where S is 0 and R is 1, the next state of Q is 1. Okay, so it's just a slightly more compact form. I'm going to do the same sort of thing for these 2 rows. Okay, when S is 1 and R is 0, well, in both cases, the next state of Q, Q plus, is 0. Okay, all right. So now there's some terminology that's associated with latches that you need to know about. And one of the terms is the term set. See, when we have this condition here, we say that the latch is set. And what set refers to is the value of Q plus. Now, it just so happens that for this AND latch, in order to get a Q plus of 1, we need to make S0 and R1. But what set means, set is defined by what the Q plus value is. It's not set by what the inputs are, because you'll see when you do a NOR latch, you'll see that Q plus is a 1 for a different set of inputs. But we would still say that that NOR latch is set when Q plus is 1. Okay, again, the reason I'm emphasizing this is a common error is people think that set is defined by the input values, but it's not. It's set, or it's defined by the Q plus value. That's what makes it set. Okay, now here's another term. When Q plus is 0, we say the latch is reset. And again, it's the same type of thing. Reset means the value Q plus is 0. It doesn't have anything to do with what the input values are. It just so happens for a NAND latch, S is 1 and R is 0 when it's reset. Okay? All right, now let's look at the bottom 2 rows. The bottom 2 rows is why this circuit exists. Okay, because if you look at the bottom 2 rows, when both S and R are both 1, well, look, if S and R are both 1 and present state of Q is 0, the next state of Q is going to be 0. And if both inputs are 1 and present state of Q is 1, well, next state of Q is 1. So what these 2 rows are telling us is if we make both inputs a 1 to this latch, we're going to retain previous data, right? Because the next state of Q is the same as what the previous state of Q was. That's storage of data. When you retain data, 1s and 0s, from a previous time, that means you've stored that data, right? And it should make sense to you that 0s and 1s represent data because 0s and 1s can be part of a binary number. Right? So if you store bits, you're storing data. Okay, so when both S and R are 1, the next state of Q is just going to equal the present state of Q. And this is when storage is happening. So this is called the storage state. Or the hold state. Okay, storage or hold. I suppose it could be called the latch state too, because latch means storage. Yeah, but I don't ever hear it called that. It's either storage or hold. Okay, so everybody good up to this point? All right, now, the top two rows, when S and R are both 0. Well, if you look here, it tells us that the next state of Q is 1. Okay, but that's not the whole story. Okay, because to understand the name that we give this state, you actually have to look at the actual circuit. Right? Because remember, I said this isn't a circuit used for analysis. That's where we get this table. But here's the circuit that you would actually hook up or model in Verilog. Look, if S and R are both 0, knowing what you know about NAND gates, what are these outputs going to equal if both those inputs are 0? Because do I have to know what that input is or that input is if that's a 0 and that's a 0? Yeah, they're both going to be 1, right? Because again, if one input to a NAND gate is a 0, I know the output is a 1. I don't have to know what the other input is. So yeah, if I have two zeros into my NAND latch, both outputs are going to be 1. Do you see a problem with that? Do you see a problem with that based on what you know about Boolean algebra? Because what does a bar over a variable mean in Boolean algebra? It means not that variable, right? So if the variable is 1, not the variable should be 0, right? It should be the opposite. But you see, this circuit doesn't give you that. When you have 2 zeros going into this NAND latch, both outputs are going to be 1. And that goes against our definition of what not a variable means in Boolean algebra. So for that reason, we call this state the forbidden state. Forbidden has 2. Forbidden. It's also called ambiguous sometimes. So that's another word they use. Okay, and what's meant by ambiguous and forbidden is just that the output values given these inputs don't make sense based on our understanding of Boolean algebra. And you want to avoid this state. And the way you avoid it is just never make both inputs equal to 0. So the reason this latch exists is because of this row here, storage of data. I mean, that's the unique feature, right? That's like its purpose. The forbidden state just is baggage. It just kind of comes along with it. And you see, this latch, whether you have cross-coupled NANDs or cross-coupled NORs, it's the most primitive way of storing data. You know, it was like the first circuit that was able to exhibit memory. There's been improvements since then. And one of the improvements is a device called a flip-flop. Okay, a flip-flop is a improvement over just the latch. Okay, so any questions up to this point before I start talking about a flip-flop? Everybody's okay? See, what you're going to see is a flip-flop doesn't have an ambiguous state in its truth table. And a flip-flop has another advantage over a latch that has to do with noise. Okay, and I'll talk about those advantages in more detail coming up. Okay, but that's sort of where we're headed. Okay, so any questions about the latch? So, like I said, one of the activities today is to take NOR gates, hook it up just like this, show the analysis circuit where the only difference from what I have up here is you're going to have NOR gates instead of NAND gates. You know, you'll need a truth table for your NOR gate. And then you just need to generate this truth table with a NOR gate example, just like I did for the NAND gate, and then condense it down just like I did here. So if you understood what I did for this NAND lab, you should be able to do that activity. It's just, you know, you got to look at a NOR truth table instead of a NAND. Okay, but the approach is the same. Okay, so everyone think they could do that okay? Okay, all right, well, let's move on now and talk about a flip-flop. Now, there are different types of flip-flops. The one that we concentrate on this class and also 233 is the D flip-flop. But any kind of flip-flop you have, it's an edge sensitive latch. And I'm going to talk about what's meant by edge sensitive. Now, every table should have this handout. And I believe I put enough copies for everybody. I think I put 4 at each table. Well, if you take a look at this handout, up in the upper left-hand corner, see this logic circuit right here? That's the logic circuit of a D flip-flop. Now, what do you see in that logic circuit that we talked about just 10 or 15 minutes ago? Yeah, there's a latch. See right here? There's a NAND latch. So a D flip-flop, it has a latch and it has additional circuitry. See, it has 2 additional NAND gates and it's got an inverter. And that additional circuitry gives it edge sensitivity. Okay, and again, we're going to talk about what edge sensitivity is coming up. Now, I put a video from YouTube on Canvas under this meeting. And that video goes over the analysis to show you how that additional logic circuitry makes this into, edge sensitive. I could go through that explanation here in class, but it would probably take me about a half hour and it wouldn't be as good as what's in that video. Okay, the video is like 15 to 20 minutes. And to really explain how you get the edge sensitivity, animation really helps. Okay, and in that video, some animation is used where I think it explains it a lot clearer than I could, and in a less time too. Okay, so I'm just going to give you the results, but if you want to see the details, I strongly recommend you watch that video. It's a well done video. Okay. All right. So notice I have 2 symbols up here. Okay, each one of these is a D flip-flop, but there's a slight difference. You see what the difference is in the diagram? It's very subtle, but there's a difference. It's almost like those like pictures for kids where you got to pick out, what's different.
You're inverting the clock.
Yeah, right here, you see the difference between these two is this clock, CLK stands for clock. This clock input has a little bubble on it, and this one doesn't. Okay, that's the only difference, and I'll talk about, what that difference means. Okay, well, let's look at the truth table for both of these flip-flops. Okay, starting with this one over here. And notice we have I should put this up here. These are our inputs. Okay, D and clock are inputs. And again, not Q and Q are outputs. Okay, so same thing for both of these. So we could have both D and Q, which is the present state of Q0, or we could have D0 and Q1, or we could have D1 and Q0, or both of these two. Okay, same thing over here. Now, the clock input, the reason why the clock input is called the clock input is because most of the time, although not all of the time, so this isn't like a 100% thing, but most of the time with sequential circuits like a flip-flop, the signal that you connect to the clock input is a periodic square wave. Okay, what I mean by periodic is that it's low the same amount of time as it is high, and it just keeps repeating. So the term clock in digital circuits, that's what it's referring to. It's referring to a square wave signal that's periodic. Now, even though that's what you most often connect to the clock input of a sequential circuit like a flip-flop, it doesn't have to be a periodic square wave. It could be any square wave. Like I could hook up a square wave that, goes high for a short amount of time, then it's low, then it goes high for a longer amount of time, right? In other words, it's not periodic. Okay, I could still do that. Okay, but the reason we call it the clock input is most of the time, most sequential circuits, you do want a periodic square wave. Okay, so I just want to make sure you understand, it doesn't have to be periodic, even though most of the time it is. Okay? Okay, well, in our truth table, for this flip-flop, we're going to symbolize the clock input as an arrow going up, an upward arrow. And I'll explain what that means shortly. But in this truth table, where the clock input has a little bubble, we're going to put a downward arrow. And you're going to see the only difference between these two truth tables, is the direction of this arrow is going under the clock input. Okay, so what do those arrows mean? Well, let's come over here. Get a better marker. This one's starting to run out. Okay, what this upward arrow symbolizes is it symbolizes when the clock, the time at which the clock changes from a 0 to a 1. Right? You see that arrow refers to the time that the signal on the clock input changes from a 0 to a 1. See, we call this the rising edge. It's also called the leading edge. And it even has a third name. Sometimes it's called the positive edge. Okay, so these are three terms that mean exactly the same thing. It's referring to the 0 to 1 transition of the clock. Well, you can probably guess that the downward arrow refers to the 1 to 0 transition of the clock. Okay, so the time at which the signal at the clock input goes from a 1 to a 0. This is called falling edge or trailing edge or negative edge. They all mean the same thing. Okay? So getting back to this truth table, the way these flip-flops work is that when the D input is a 0, at the time of the 0 to 1 transition of the clock, the next state of Q is going to equal 0. Okay, same thing for this second run. When D is 0 and Q is 1, at the time of the 0 to 1 transition of the clock, the next state of Q is going to be 1. Okay, and then for these next two rows where D is equal to 1, well, at the time of the 0 1 transition of the clock, the next state of Q is going to be a 1. And that's true also for this type of D flip-flop. The only difference is this output Q plus is going to equal the D input at the time of the 1 to 0 transition of the clock instead of the 0 to 1 transition of the clock. Okay? So the way that you can summarize both of these is that the next state of Q will equal input D at the time of the appropriate clock transition. Okay, what do I mean by appropriate? Well, if it's this type of flip-flop, the appropriate clock transition is 0 to 1. If it's this type of D flip-flop, the appropriate transition is the 1 to 0 transition. Okay, but the key thing is the next state of Q can only equal whatever the D input is at that specific time of that appropriate clock transition. For all other time, right? For all other time of the clock other than the appropriate clock transition, Q is just going to remain the same. See, the only possible time it can equal input D is on that time of that clock transition. And you see, that's what we mean by edge sensitive. See, flip-flops are sensitive to a clock edge, either the rising or the falling, depending on which one you have. Okay? Now, over here, we can kind of skip ahead a little bit. Over here, you see this RET? This stands for rising edge trigger. Okay, this is rising edge trigger. Okay, well, this type of D flip-flop right here is rising edge trigger because it depends on the rising edge of the clock. And then this is falling edge trigger. Falling edge trigger. Okay, so that would be this flip-flop, right? Because it depends on the 1 to 0 transition, which is the falling edge. Okay? So there's two types of flip-flops, but the only thing that's different is when they're triggered, right? One is on the rising edge, the 0 to 1 transition. The other one's on the falling edge, the 1 to 0 transition. Okay, so any questions up to this point? All right, well, now let me talk about the two advantages a flip-flop has over a latch. Well, the first advantage is, look, in these truth tables, there's no forbidden state or no ambiguous state like you have with the latch. Okay, so that's one advantage. You know, no forbidden state in truth table. Now you're going to see, okay, when we get to that tiny diagram over there, you're going to see that you can still have an ambiguous situation that comes up when you have an edge-sensitive device like a flip-flop, but it's not in the truth table. Okay, it's something else, and we'll get to that coming up. Now, the next advantage a flip-flop has over a latch has to do with noise. And this is where if you've had some sort of lab where you've had like either a voltmeter or an oscilloscope, you have a little bit of an advantage. How many people have ever used like a voltmeter or an oscilloscope? Probably EEs, right? Because the EE took that 151 class. So the CPEs probably haven't dealt with equipment like that yet. Well, whenever you take a class like that, a lab, you know, we use that type of equipment, you see that, you know, quantities in electrical circuits, logic circuits, you know, voltage and current, they vary over time. They're not very steady. They fluctuate some. And one of the reasons why a voltage or a current can fluctuate is because of noise. Okay, just extraneous signals that are in your environment. Like in this room right now, you know, there's transmissions going on, you know, with phones, and there's electromagnetic energy leaking from computers because even though they're shielded really well, there's always something, you know, some energy that's going to escape in. And that, you know, electromagnetic energy that's in our environment, it causes what we call noise. And noise is just like spikes in voltage. And remember, we talked about how the zeros and ones are voltage levels. Like a 0 ideally is exactly 0 volts, and you know, 1 is exactly some plus amount of voltage, like 5 volts or 3.3 volts. But you'll learn in your later classes that in actuality, you know, as a 0 is any voltage below a certain amount, like 1.5 volts. And a 1 is, you know, a voltage above that same threshold of say 1.5 volts. Well, you can have a case where if you get noise, which is like a spike, you know, a quick spike in time in voltage, well, it can possibly change a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. And that can change how your circuit is behaving. And you see, a latch is much more sensitive to noise than a flip-flop, because a latch is level sensitive, right? It's just depending on whether we have zeros and ones here. So if I get noise at any time, if I get a spike in voltage at any time, it could possibly corrupt my data. It could change my output that I didn't intend to change. Where with a flip-flop, because it's edge sensitive and Q can only change on an edge of a clock, right, at that exact time of that clock transition, well, flip-flops are more immune to noise, right? Because that noise would have to happen at that specific time of that clock transition. And you know, that can happen. It's not like flip-flops are immune from noise. They're just less susceptible to noise. Okay? So because of the edge sensitivity, flip-flops are less sensitive to noise. Okay, then latches. So less sensitive to noise than a latch. Okay, so See, I'm probably gonna have to go another like half hour or so, if not a little longer. So you want to take a break at this point, maybe a 5-minute break? It's 5 of, so if we take a 5-minute break, we can start at the top of the hour. So why don't we do that? Take a little break. So I'll start up again at 1 o'clock. Take a 5-minute break.
Yeah, I need a record. I think yeah, I just want
I was thinking, all right. So like the story.
yeah.
I guess
Right now, another question.
Well, I would, you know, anything that was on an activity or I mean, like there was an activity where you had all of our right? Like different forms, like, yeah, so anything like in an activity or I had to be able to.
You know, like how like the format, like you said, like multiple choice for response to both of them, or
No, it's, I would, you know, look at the topics if you haven't already, you know, the topics right with my policy. And then, I would go through the activities, I would, look at the lectures too, like, I record them, so if you don't have the notes, you can look at the lectures. But it's more like activities. I don't think there's any other choice. I mean, there are some classes I get multiple choice, but not this class. What'd you say? Well, I think I put in that topic that I'm not going to ask you to write code, but you should be able to interpret it. Like if I gave something in parallel, you should be able to look at it and know what's know what it's doing. But I'm not going to ask you to write it because that will be, evaluated during the final project whether you can write. Okay, it's time to get started here. It's top of the hour. So before I continue, because see, now things are going to get a little bit more complicated because typically a flip-flop has more inputs than just the D and the clock input. Like typically it will have what's called an enable input, a reset, and a set. So before we start into this, again, I just want to ask before I continue, any questions up to this point? Okay. All right. So like I said, flip-flops often have these inputs. Now, another name for enable is enter. Like sometimes it'll be called enter instead of enable. And then there's even another name, load. All right, so enter, load, enable all mean the same thing here. And then reset, sometimes it's called clear. And then set. I don't think there's another word for set, at least I'm not aware of another one. Okay. All right, so first, enable. Now, so like on your flip-flop diagram, you might see another input labeled EN for enable. Okay. And what the enable input is that when it's activated, now I'll talk about what we mean by activated coming up. But when activated, Q, next state of Q can equal D. Okay. See, if you don't have enable input and you just have the D input and the clock input, well, the D flip-flop is going to do exactly what we talked about in this truth table, right? That on the appropriate edge, that's when next state of Q is going to equal D. Well, if I have an enable, in order for the next state of Q to equal D, I also have to have the enable activated. If I don't have the enable activated, well, then this isn't going to happen. Basically, the flip-flop doesn't do anything if it's not enabled. Okay? All right, then there's also reset. And on your diagram, reset typically is at the bottom. And they just use an R like that. Or on your symbol, I should say, not that. But when reset is activated, it will make the next state of Q equal to 0. Okay, and that's regardless. That would be regardless what the D input is doing. Okay, so reset, when it's activated, it sort of like takes over. It's like dominant, if you will, the dominant input. Okay, then set. Okay, when activated, it will make the next state of Q equal to a 1. Okay, and again, it'll make next state of Q equal to 1 no matter what the D input is. It's a dominant input. And usually reset has precedence over set. So if both of these were activated at the same time, most often reset would be the one that takes over, makes the output equal to 0. Okay? All right, so what's meant by activated? Well, what's meant by activated is what you have to put on that input to make it happen. And there's active low inputs and active high. And active low, to activate input requires a 0. And active high, you can probably guessed, now that you know what active low is. Active high is activated or to activate an active high input requires a 1 on the input. And each one of these inputs can either be active low or active high. So, you know, you can have active high enable, active high reset, active high set. You can have active low enable, active low reset, active low set. In a symbol, if they're active high, then they're shown as you see here. If they're active low, there's a bubble. Okay, so this would be an active low enable. This would be an active low set. This would be an active low reset. See also, and this can be confusing, I know, but again, don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you the way it is. And that's on a symbol like this, and also in a timing diagram that we're going to get to, when there's a bar over an input, it doesn't mean not, like it does in a Boolean equation. A bar over an input in a diagram or in a timing diagram means active low. Okay, so this is active low set, active low reset, active low enable. Okay, if there's no bar, active high, active high, active high. One more thing. Now, also with the clock, because it's edge sensitive, and that's what this triangle means. The triangle means it's an edge sensitive input. Well, if there's no bubble on a clock, that means rising edge. And if there's a bubble, that means falling edge. Okay, so on a clock input, it doesn't mean not or active low or active high. It means, like I just said, rising edge, falling edge. So I know, again, it's weird. Something has several different meanings depending on the context, but that's just the way it is. You had a question? Is it William? Are you William? No, I answered. Oh, are you William now? Yeah. Oh, just want to make sure. I'm starting to get the names down. Finally. Okay, so any questions about what active low or active high means, or any of these inputs?
Mr. Did you say that the enable reset set, are those dependent on clock cycle, or are those like?
That's the next thing.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the next thing, because these inputs can either depend on the clock or not depend on the clock. And that's what's meant by synchronous and asynchronous, is that if you have a synchronous input, not only does that input have to be activated, okay, so not only does input have to be activated, in addition, input has to be activated, during the time of the appropriate clock transition. No, that's a lot of words. When we get to the timing diagram, I think that's where a timing diagram helps. Okay, so when you have a synchronous input, not only does that input have to be activated, right? Have the right value, either a 0 or 1, depending if it's active low or active high, but it has to be activated during the time of the appropriate clock transition. So if it's a rising edge triggered flip-flop, that input would have to be activated at the time the clock changes 0 to 1. And if it's a falling edge triggered flip-flop, that input would have to be activated at the time that the clock transitions from 1 to 0. Now, if it's asynchronous, it doesn't depend on the clock at all. Okay, so it doesn't depend on clock. So if you have an asynchronous active low reset, the minute that reset goes to 0, the reset's going to happen. Okay, because if it's asynchronous, it doesn't depend on the clock at all. Okay, now we're going to do a timing diagram example, and in that example, I can show you, hopefully I can show you like the clear difference between these two. I would say that this activity that you're going to do today, now, again, part of the activity is a new or latch, but the other part of the activity is going to be doing a timing diagram, like, or timing diagrams. I think I have 6 of them for you to do. That's like the one I'm going to do here in class. And I would say that this activity probably pertains to CPE 233 the most of all the activities. Okay, that in 233, it's really important that you have a good understanding of the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. Because when I taught that class in the winter, I would say that was probably the biggest hang up that, you know, not all students, but, you know, more students than I would think, you know, had some difficulty with that at the beginning of the course. I mean, they got it sorted out, you know, but, you know, they had a little bit of a learning curve there. Okay, but hopefully in this example, I can show you more clearly the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. All right, so let's go ahead now and let's look at this timing diagram. So, you know, this is a D flip-flop and it's going to be rising edge. Okay, so it's a rising edge D flip-flop. The reset is active low synchronous. The set is active low asynchronous. And you can see in the timing diagram that the enable is not shown. So either there is no enable or the enable is always 1 and it's active high. So if something's always its active value, a lot of times they'll leave it out of the timing diagram and they'll just state that it's active. Okay. All right. So like with any timing diagram, you always start on the left. That's where t equals 0. And then you just kind of work your way to the right. Okay. And as things change, you just figure out what the Q output is. Well, if you look here at t equals 0, our reset is not active, right? Because it's high and it's an active low. So when an active low input is high, that means it's not active. Same thing with this active low set. Okay, you can see over here, it drops down. So it starts off high. So we're not resetting. We're not setting. You can see the D value here starts at 1, and we got our clock starting at 0. So because we're not resetting or setting at t equals 0, the Q output at t equals 0 is unknown. It could either be a 0 or a 1. I mean, it has to be either a 0 or 1. It's just, we don't know what it is at this point because we haven't reset or set the flip-flop at this initial time of t equals 0. So in a timing diagram, when you don't know what the value of the output is, you can just put a question mark or you can put an X. Okay, here I'll put a question mark. Okay. All right. So now the next thing that changes as we go in time here is you can see this reset, this active low reset goes from a 1 to a 0. So let's look at the other inputs here at this time. Okay, well, if you look here at this time, the set is a 1, so we're not setting. D is a 1, and the clock is still 0. So since this is a synchronous active low reset, what do you think happens here at this time?
You don't know what to do anything.
Yeah, it's not going to reset because since it's synchronous, you not only have to have the active value, which we do have, but you have to have the edge of the clock, which we don't have yet. So you see, if this is a synchronous reset, it's not going to reset until the reset is 0 and at the time of the 0 to 1 transition of the clock. So we're just going to have a question mark here. We're not going to know what the output is until we get that clock edge along with the active value reset. Then we can say this is a 0. Okay. Now, to show you the difference, let me say one more thing, and then I'll take your question. Now, to show you the difference between async and sync, okay? This is synchronous. If this active low reset had been asynchronous, then at this time, when the reset becomes active, because asynchronous doesn't depend on the clock, that's when Q would go to 0. See, Q would go to 0 at this time if it was asynchronous. But since it's synchronous, it doesn't go to 0 until the edge of the clock comes along. That's the difference. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was going to say,
are synchronous, they are changing at the same time.
Ah. Yeah, we were gonna get to that later, but since you brought it up now, that's a great question. And the question is this. The question is, what if, we keep reset synchronous and active low, but what if it changed? What if it changed right here? What if our synchronous reset input changed at the exact same time at the edge of the clock? That's what you're asking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, you just pointed out how an edge triggered flip-flop like this can still be ambiguous, right? Because if that happens, if you have a change of input right at the same time as the appropriate edge of the clock, flip a coin to see what the output's going to be. It's going to either be a 0 or 1, but we don't know. Like 50% of the time it'll be one value, 50% of the time it'll be the other value. It's literally just flip a coin. So that's what I meant by, the flip-flop has the advantage over the latch where it doesn't have an ambiguous state in the truth table, but you can still get an ambiguous situation, and you pointed it out. So that's one of the things that digital designers get paid big bucks to do, is to make sure you don't run into a situation like this. When you take your CPE133 and make that microprocessor, you definitely don't want to run into a situation like this, because your microprocessor then it's not going to be reliable, because it may work half the time, but it's probably not going to work the other half of the time, because again, this is a flip of the coin situation. Okay, so any more questions up to this point? Okay, so we're going back that it's synchronous, and the output goes to 0 right at the time of this transition of the clock. So let's see, the next thing that happens here, now this is rising edge, so that's why I have all the 0 to 1 transitions of the clock with little arrows, because those are the ones that matter, okay, since it's rising edge, right? The trailing edges don't matter if you have rising edge tree or flip-flop. Okay, so the next thing to look at is this time right here, right? Because after, after this asynchronous reset is low, it goes high, so it's not active. Set is still high here, so it's not active. So if you're not resetting and you're not setting, you got to look at what the D value is at the time of the 0 to 1 transitions, because again, that's when the next state of Q can equal D, right? Is on that appropriate clock edge. So you see, the next thing we would look at here is the time of this clock edge and what D equals. See, at this time, D equals 1. So Q would be 0 until this time here, and then it would go and equal D. It would go up to a 1. All right, so you see it's a question mark until it gets reset. When it gets reset, it's 0, and now it's going to stay 0 until it hits this clock edge where D is equal to 1, and then next state of Q equals D and goes to 1.
So change only occurs like in the instant that the clock changes.
Right. If you're not resetting and you're not setting, the output is then going to depend on what D is at the time of the 0 to 1 clock transition. And again, that's all provided enable is active. Right. If we had it, if enable at this time here, if enable was 0, then it would just stay 0. Because if it's not enabled, the output just stays what it is.
Yes, in this example, between those two rises, if R were to change like at all, affect.
Okay, so between these two here,
Yeah.
you're saying that what R goes to 1 and then goes back to 0?
Yes, change it at all.
Well, let's see. If it's between these two clock edges and R goes up to 1, and if it's still synchronous, nothing's going to change, right? Because a clock edge hasn't come along. But now if it goes back to 0 and it's 0 during this clock edge.
I'm saying if it goes to 0 back to 1.
Okay, 0 then back to 1. So it's a 1 during the time of this clock. It would just stay 0 because it wouldn't reset. And if you're not resetting and you're not setting, then Q is going to depend on what the D value is at the time of the edge of the clock. Okay. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Any other questions? Okay, so let's keep going here. So this is a 1 now. So now at this next time of this edge of the clock, so right here, see again, set is 1 and reset is 1, so they're not active. So at this time, the Q output is just gonna equal the D input, which is now 0. So Q output would stay a 1 until this clock edge and then go to a 0. Okay. All right, next thing in. You can see that I put this clock edge very close to when D was changing. So the way I have it drawn here, at the time of this clock edge, D is a 1, and again, we're not setting, we're not resetting. So at that time, the Q output would go to a 1. But the reason I put it really close is because I was going to bring up what you asked earlier. I was going to say, okay, what if this clock edge was right at the time of D changing from a 1 to a 0? And it would be ambiguous, as William pointed out when we were talking about if the reset happened at the same time as the synchronous reset happened at the same time as the clock edge. Yeah, so since we already covered that, we'll skip by it. So the next thing is this. Oh, well, the next thing that happens is this reset here at this time goes low. Okay, but what's going to happen at the Q output? Because remember, this is synchronous. So when that synchronous reset goes low at this time, what would this Q output be? It went to a 1 here. Is it going to stay a 1 and go to 0? It's synchronous, so what else does it need? If it's synchronous, what else does it need to be activated to happen? Need what? The clock edge. So you see at this time here, when the reset becomes active, we don't have a 0-1 transition to the clock. So the reset's not going to happen, right? Because it's not enough for a synchronous input to be active. It has to be active during the edge of the clock, the appropriate edge of the clock. So this would just stay a 1. It would stay a 1. And then when we get to this clock edge, what's going to happen at that clock edge?
Back to 0.
Back to 0 because it would just equal D. So it's going to go back to 0. Okay, so it's going to be at 0. What's going to happen next?
Set's gonna put 2 to 1.
Right, exactly. See, when this set, which is active low, goes to 0, and it's async. So because it's async, it doesn't need the clock edge. So the minute that goes low and becomes active, it's going to set the output back to 1. So you see right here, that would go back to 1. Then it's going to stay a 1. Then what's going to happen here? It's not reset, it's not set. So Q is going to equal what at the time of this 0-1 transition of the clock? Right, it's going to equal D, which is 0, so it's going to go back to 0. And then does it stay at 0 for the end, or what's going to happen? Yeah, right here, when set goes to 0, again, because it's asynchronous, the output's going to be set to 1. Okay, so any questions again about the difference between synchronous and asynchronous? That's probably the most important thing when you're doing these timing diagrams. And also, it's very important, CPE133. Most of your inputs in that microprocessor that you build in 233 are synchronous, but there are some asynchronous. There's a few. Did you have a question?
Why was power settings and carry on as three settings?
Oh, why? That's a good question. I mean, it's just the way the logic circuitry inside this, or the logic circuitry that this symbol represents works. Like, you know, what you have on this sheet here. Okay, remember, this is the latch. If you add this logic circuitry, it gives the edge sensitivity. Now, if it has set and reset, there's additional circuitry that's not shown here. Like there's additional gates. And that additional circuitry is what makes this happen. Okay, so you could go on Google and you could, I'm sure you could find the logic circuit of a flip-flop like this that has the additional logic for set and reset. It's just additional gates. Yeah, the more inputs you have and the more features you have on a flip-flop, the more complicated the circuit is, the logic circuit. Actually, when you model this, because you'll model a flip-flop in lab 5, you could go into the elaborated design, and you could actually look at what Verilog comes up with circuit. But I don't know when, it was a long time ago, I speculate that, these definitions came up, that someone decided, okay, well, when we make this input active and Q goes to 0, we're gonna call that reset, and when we force Q to be 1, when this input is active, we're gonna call that set. Somebody made up the terms, I don't know when. It's been like that ever since I've been around, so it's been a while. All right, but any other questions? Are you confident that you could do a timing diagram like this? Because again, the activity has about 6 timing diagrams where you're given this, it's either rising edge, falling edge, it's either sync or async, active low, active high, and you just got to come up with what the output is. Okay. All right, we're almost done here. Another maybe 15 minutes. Now I'm going to show you the system Verilog to model a flip-flop. So actually, let me move this over a little bit. Kind of ran out of room here. So, like other modules you've done, you got to give your flip-flop module a name. So maybe you call it DFF. Okay, then you got to declare your inputs and outputs. Now for lab 5, the flip-flop that you're going to be modeling in lab 5, it's going to have a D input, a clock input, like all D flip-flops do. But it's also going to have an enable. I think we call it enter instead of enable, but again, same thing. It's going to have a set. It's going to have a reset. Okay, so you're going to have 5 inputs. You only need the Q output because in lab 5, we're only using the Q output. We're not using not Q, so you don't have to declare it or define it. I mean, you could declare it, but it's not going to get connected to anything. So it'd be like your carry out of your RCA in lab 4. Okay, but here's a difference from what you've seen before, because when you have a flip-flop or any sequential circuit for that matter, so any circuit that has memory, you don't use an always comb, right? Remember, COMB stands for combinational. You only use always comb blocks for combinational circuits, circuits that don't have memory. When you have a sequential circuit, you use an always _ FF. Just to make sure I get the syntax right here. After the FF, you then put the @ symbol. And then in parentheses, you either put pause edge or neg edge, and then clock, CLK for clock. So when you put pause edge clock, this is going to make it rising edge trigger. Okay, and that's what we want for lab 5. For falling edge trigger, you would just do neg edge clock. And whatever's in the parentheses, that's when the always FF block gets evaluated. So you see, by putting pause edge clock here, whatever we put next in this always FF block, it will get evaluated on every positive edge of the clock, every 0 to 1 transition of the clock. Okay? And for your flip-flop, use an if statement. So I'm going to make sure I get the syntax right, because I think what I wrote in my notes here is correct for the syntax. Well, just like an always comb, you have to start with a begin, okay, and you'll need an end for that begin. But then you put the if statement. So we're going to make reset the highest precedence. Okay, and when you have an if statement, whatever's first in that if statement has the highest precedence. Okay, so within the if statement, precedence is determined by order that you list it from top to bottom. So making reset the highest precedence. And also all our inputs in lab 5 are going to be active high. So you see, if reset is active, what do we want to happen? What do we want Q to equal if reset is active at the time of the positive edge of the clock? Right, because all these inputs are going to be synchronous.
Wait, is it active low or active high reset?
It's active high reset. If you wanted active low, you would put an exclamation point before it. So you see, this if statement is going to be evaluated on every 0 to 1 transition of the clock. So if reset is active, if reset's a 1 at the time of the positive edge of the clock, we want Q to do what?
Go to 0.
Right, we want Q to go to 0, right? Because that's what reset means. So if reset's active at the time of this positive edge of the clock, we want Q to be 0. Now, here's another very important item. Notice that when I assign Q to 0, I use the less than, then the equal. I didn't just use the equal. When you have an always FF block, that's how you have to assign output. You have to use the less than with the equal. You don't just use the equal. Okay, you just use the equal when it's an always cone. Okay, and here's the reason why. Here's the difference. Okay, when you have the less than with the equal, that's called non-blocking. I don't really know why they call it non-blocking, but that's the term they use. When it's just an equal sign, it's called blocking. So you want the equal sign for an always cone. And you want the less than with the equal for an always FF. Okay, but here's what's important. If I have 2 lines like this in my system Verilog code, right? First, I'm assigning A to B, and then B to C, and then I'm doing the same thing. The only difference is I've got the non-blocking here, and I've got the blocking here. Well, with the equal, within the always cone, if you set A to B and then B to C, well, A will equal C after this. Okay, because system Verilog, the way it will model is it will just put these 3, okay, A, B, C on the same wire, okay, the same connection, so they'll all be equal. But when you do non-blocking like this, A does not equal C, okay, because you'll have A, B, and C, but they're not going to all be on the same wire. They're going to be separated by circuitry. Okay, so they don't equal. This circuitry is needed for the memory portion of the always FF block. Okay, so if you use the less than with the equal sign within an always cone, you're going to get unwanted memory. If you use the equal sign within the always FF, you're going to be missing memory you thought you had. Okay, so that's why it's important to use the proper assignment syntax. Okay, this is a very common error. People either just have the equal, or they should have the less than with the equal, or they'll have the less than the equal when they should just have the equal. In fact, if you look at that, well, not the handout I gave you, but or maybe it is on. Can I see the handout? Did I correct it on? Yeah, I corrected it on the handout I gave you, but on the original handout I had, it didn't have the less than, it just had the equal, which was incorrect. Okay, the next thing you would do in your if statement is you would put an else if, and then you would put set, right? So if we're not resetting and we're setting, we want Q to be what if we're setting? 1. Okay, again, that's what set means. Remember we said earlier? 1. Okay, now if we're not resetting, we're not setting, then we're going to look at the enable. We're going to have an else if. Now I think it's called enter in lab 5. So we'll put enter, but again, enter and enable are the same thing. So if we're not resetting and we're not setting, then if we're enabling, if we're entering, that's when the next data Q is going to equal, it's going to equal the D input. So this would just be Q assigned to D. By the way, these are semicolons. Okay. All right. Well, now, if we're not resetting and we're not setting and we're not entering, what do you think the last thing is we're doing. We're not doing any of these things. What do you think the flip-flop's gonna do?
Just reading.
Or just storing? Yeah, see, if we're not resetting and we're not setting and we're not entering, which if you're entering, you're gonna change the Q output to whatever the D input is, well, then you're storing data. And remember, when we had an always comb block, we would want to end an else, right? Because if you don't end an if statement with an else, it creates a latch. Well, here we do want to create a latch because that's the memory, right? So if we're not doing any of these things, we just want to retain the previous output. Okay, we want to store the previous output. So you would just leave out the else. Okay, so I'll make a comment here. You know, no else, right? Because if you have no else, that creates a latch. So memory. And that means your next data Q is just going to equal Q. Your outputs are just going to stay the same.
I have a question. Why do we not need begin and maximum?
Oh, well, oh, why don't we need it here? Like for the if? When you only have one output, you don't need it. If you have several out, well, if you have more than one output, then you do need a begin end. So like in that comparator example, when we weren't initializing the outputs to begin with, and we had to list the values of all the outputs, that's when we needed the begin end. Okay, but if you're only showing one output, then you don't need the begin end for the if. Now we do have to end this begin. So you know, there'd be an end and an end module just to finish this. You had a question?
I think you might have looked at this in the last lecture, but let's say if you had the only output is Q, and in one of the output statements you didn't set Q, that would also be a latch, right? So that's where Q was.
Yeah, like if you leave Q out, like of an else if or something, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, that would create a latch too.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, this is sort of the standard way, so to speak, of setting up like a flip-flop. Is that, you know, first you have, you know, because again, this gives reset the highest precedence, then set gets the next precedence, and then, you know, enable. And if it's not any of those things, then it's just gonna, you know, keep the previous data. Another question?
What would be syntax for the no else thing? Like, would it be inside the loop or would it be outside?
No, this is a comment that, yeah, 2 slashes in Verilog is a comment. So I'm just putting a comment that we don't put an else here because that's what's going to create the memory. So, you know, do you see now why prior to today, we wanted you not to have warnings that said there was a latch? Because prior to today, your circuitry should not have had memory, right? So like prior to today, if someone had a latch warning, that probably would mean they made a mistake in their if statement, you know, like they left something out or the case statement. But now we want to create a latch. See, that's why the Vital gives you a warning instead of an error, right? Because it's just warning you, hey, did you want to create memory? And if you wanted to, then okay, that's okay. I wanted to do that. Yeah. So when you're doing lab 5, you want to see that latches are created. Like you'll get a warning, but that's what you want to see. Okay. All righty.
Oh, I didn't see. What does FF stand for?
I think it just stands for flip-flop, but it doesn't mean that, I mean, there's other sequential circuits, like when we get to an FSM, which is a finite state machine next week, you're gonna see an FSM has both a sequential portion and a combinational portion. It's like a combination of both. And when you model an FSM, you're gonna see that you always use an always FF, but it's not gonna be like, it's not gonna look like a flip-flop. You know, it's gonna be, actually, it's very short. But yeah, I imagine that's what it stands for, but it's not that you can only use this for a flip-flop. It's any sequential circuit you would put in always FF. Probably because the flip-flop's the most common sequential circuit, maybe that's why they decided to use that FF. Alrighty, so let's see what's left. I want to show you, well, this is the answer to the door latch. Okay, so again, one part of the activity is just to write this latch with just NORs. You go through the same approach I did for the NAND. And if you do it correctly, you should get this truth table, because you want to do this analysis until you get to this part. Okay, so once you get to this part, compare it to what I have, and hopefully you get the same answer. Just a couple other things I want to show you before you get started in your groups. And they're on Canvas. We've got my computer. All right. So yeah, first thing I wanted to point out, here's that video I was referring to that shows you how you get the edge sensitivity by adding that additional circuitry to the lab. So again, I strongly recommend you watch that at some point. I know the resolution's lousy here, but again, you'll be able to see on Canvas. There's a PDF that has 6 timing diagrams, just like the one we went through. And here it tells you whether it's falling edge or rising edge trigger, you know, synchronous or active low. Okay, so it's all here for that. And then the last thing is, like I mentioned earlier, is just to show that you can do a NOR latch, just like I did my NAND latch. So there's 2 parts to it. There's the PDF with the timing diagrams, and then doing the NOR latch analysis. And then lab 5. Now, if you haven't finished lab 4, of course, that's the priority because that's due Friday, right after the midterm, this Thursday. Lab 5 is not due till Friday of next week. But if you don't lab 4 and you get the activity done, and you want to start lab 5, let me just briefly point out some things about lab 5. I'll go over this in more detail after the midterm on Thursday. But lab 5 is basically taking what you have from lab 4 and modifying it to add memory and also to add a module that Dr. Mealy designed that does time multiplexing. And what Dr. Mealy's time multiplexing module allows is to show displays on multiple 7-segment displays. Okay, with the decoder you have, you can only show data. Well, you would only be able to show the same data on all 4 displays if you enabled all 4. But to show different data on the 4 different 7-segment displays, you need what's called time multiplexing. And that's what this module does that Dr. Mealy designed. And I'll talk more about it on Thursday. But as you can see here, Lab 5 doesn't contain all the modules that you needed for Lab 4. So for example, you don't need this decoder that you had for Lab 4. For Lab 5, you don't need this MUX. Okay, so that's why they're X'd out. Also, you don't need this neg output. That should be a red X too. Okay, so you're getting rid of this module, this MUX, and also the neg output. And then you're going to attach this that has memory along with Dr. Mealy's module to the rest of your Lab 4. Okay, so each one of these modules here is labeled a register. And we're going to talk about what a register is on Thursday, but real quick, a flip-flop can store 1 bit, a register can store multiple bits. So you're going to see a register is just made out of multiple flip-flops. Now, having said that, these 2 modules that are labeled registers are really just flip-flops because this register and this register, they're just storing 1 bit. This register is storing the validity bit coming from your validity checker. This register is storing the 1 bit that tells us whether it's negative or not. Okay, what's coming out of this AND gate, you know, whether the result is negative or not. This module, that's really a register because see, this module is storing the binary that was going into this decoder, right? It's storing your numerical answer to your addition or subtraction. So because it's 4 bits, this register has to store 4 bits. So it's actually made out of 4 flip-flops. Okay. And then, like I said, this is the time multiplexer. We give you this code. Now, I don't have the actual file. Like, there was something that we gave you that was a file, right, that you just downloaded. I can't remember what it is right now. Or has there been, oh, like the constraints file, right? You could just download it. This one here, we give you the text. So you'll have to copy, paste the text into a file that's within your project. And two things to watch out for when you do that. One is when you do the paste, make sure you don't get any wraparound, okay? Because sometimes what's happened in the past is, there'll be a line of code that's all supposed to be on one line. And when they paste it in, it somehow wraps around. And now something that was supposed to be a comment, the compiler thinks it's some sort of code when it's, part of a comment that, that wrapped around and doesn't have the slashes at the beginning. So it thinks it's code. So watch out for that. And then the other thing to watch out for is that this module is coded in Verilog instead of system Verilog. So when you create the file, make sure you're creating a Verilog file and not a system Verilog file. Okay? So, I mean, if you're done with lab 4 and you have time after the activity, the one thing you could do today, if you wanted to, is you could actually model these two registers here, because again, because they're only storing 1 bit, it's just a flip-flop. So I gave you the code essentially for that. And on Thursday, I'll talk about how you code, a register that, has multiple bits. It's actually very easy. Or we make it easier for you than we did the RCA, because we could have you do it the same approach as the RCA, but since you've done that already, we're going to actually show you a smarter way to do it. And then you're going to wonder why we had you do the RCA the way we did, but it was to teach you structural modeling. So anyway, I think that's all that I had. This diagram here is just the part that you add on. So like I said, this one here shows what you get rid of from lab 4 and then what you keep from lab 4, and it also has that same diagram to show you, what you need to add. All right, so do you have any questions? I did a little bit better than my 8 to 11. My 8 to 11 I didn't get done till top of the hour, so I was a little faster this time. But any questions? Because now what you would want to do is the activities, and I showed you the activity, it's on Canvas, so you just go to the meeting 11. And then once you're done with that, if you have time, you can work on either lab 4 or lab 5. Also remember, you have to show me at some point before the end of Thursday's class that you can pull over that like intermediate signal and put it onto the timing diagram. Remember, Dr. Benson has a video, Dr. Benson's troubleshooting video, and she shows you exactly how to do it. So you just got to watch that video and then show me how to do it.